Okay, welcome back to Wildlife Cake and Cocktails, episode 12. I'm your host Yanni, and today we're talking about the endangered and elusive night parrot. Very excited about this episode. Now, obviously, I understand they're Australian arid centre bird, so we're drinking desert birds. It's a half a shot of mezcal, falernum, which is it's a bar syrup with a lot of different spices, cloves, star anise, Aperol, an Italian aperitif liqueur, some bitters and some lime juice, and I also understand that the night parrot leaves its roosts at night to go eat seeds.
This is true.
We're also having a lemon and poppy seed cake, which is pretty simple, but it's delicious. And our guest today, well, I'm very excited about this one, Mr. Nick Leseberg from the University of Queensland. He's a PhD candidate and a night parrot researcher for Bush Heritage Australia. Starting with a Bachelor of Technology and then moving on to do a graduate diploma in science, majoring in ecology at the University of New England. He's worked as a field ecologist on various projects throughout Australia and Papua New Guinea. Has been a guide for birding and nature and photography tours, as well as authoring / co-authoring a couple of birding field guides. As we mentioned, he's currently a PhD candidate in biogeography, studying the ecology and conservation biology of the night parrot at UQ's School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. The project is supported by Bush Heritage Australia, the Max Day Enviroscience Fellowship, Birds Queensland, the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and more. Nick, thanks so much for joining us, man.
Thanks so much for having me, Yanni, and thanks for this delicious cocktail.
No worries. I hope that you like it. Obviously, we've got our night parrot theme going. Pretty exciting times for night parrot researchers at the moment.
It is. They're you'd swear they're popping up all over the place, but being close to the action, I know that's not getting too excited just yet. There's certainly more turning up than had turned up for the last 100 years, sure. But we're a long way from knowing that much about them. Sure. Now,
obviously they're very, very elusive. I think the Smithsonian Institute has classified them as the world's most elusive bird. I think. Look. Are we finding more of them now just because we are starting to get a bit more of an understanding of their ecology? Is that what's going on? Or?
Yeah. Look, it's a great question. It's it's sort of hard to know where to start with to answer it. So I used to say to people, I don't know, about 5 years ago, I used to do a bit of bird tour stuff, and I used to say about the night parrot, it was the only bird that if you had, unlimited time and unlimited money, it's about the only bird in the world I can think of where no one will be able to take you to see it somewhere. And because there are people that pay big money to go and see these rare birds, but the night parrot was the one, like I said, however much time you had, however much money, you couldn't find it. That's not quite true now. We know a couple of places where they occur, but we're still, like I said, although you see it in the news a bit, we're still only up to, only a very small handful of places.
Yeah, a handful of sightings, basically.
Yeah, that's right, where we know it's occurred.
Right.
And it's not, why there's more in the last year is probably, you're probably right, it's probably due to the fact that we know a little bit more about its ecology, a little bit more about where to find it, what sort of things it needs, and most importantly, we're starting to key on the call, which is the most, that's pretty acoustics. It's the only way to reliably detect it with any sort of efficiency. You can't sort of just tramp through, thousands and thousands of hectares of spinifex hoping to flush them. So
it's too much territory to cover, right? I mean, from what you guys have them, you're studying them here in Queensland, but they were recently found up in the Kimberley, out in WA, and Lake Eyre sort of region. So that's pretty much the whole arid centre, basically, anywhere that there's spinifex.
That's right. Yeah, and you look back through the historical records, which I'm doing as part of my PhD, and that's it. So they've been found right across Australia. Every mainland state has good records of night parrots. Even northwestern Victoria in the spinifex and the mallee down there. Back in the late 1800s, they were down there. They're in, like I said, every mainland state has good records of them, and so they're, like I said, very widespread. It's just a matter of such a huge area to search, and like I said, there's no efficient way to search that unless as we're finding out, without knowing what they sound like. Now that we know what they sound like, we're starting to dig up a few more records.
Right, and on top of that, obviously the the populations have taken a massive hit. They were much more common and much easier to find. I mean, in some of the records.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. So there's a lot of historical literature about the night parrot, obviously, but
not a lot of quantitative.
Exactly, no quantitative stuff, and all of it is very, like you say, qualitative. So it's from the late 1800s, and it's people. And it's no one. There was only one guy that wrote anything about night parrots that had direct experience with the bird. That was a guy called Andrews, and he wrote a couple of papers in. Actually, the only paper he wrote was in 1883, but he had direct field experience with the bird. He collected. So it's about 28 birds, sort of specimens, skins that are in museums, and we think he collected probably about 22 or 23 of them himself. So he was the only guy that had any field experience with the bird. Other than that, all the other literature is just people saying, I talked to old mate, who was a manager on this property 20 years ago, and he said that, night parrots were not that noteworthy but one thing that is clear in the literature is that around the 1880s sometime, particularly where they were known in South Australia, Victoria, they were maybe not common, but like I said, not necessarily noteworthy. Right. But then sometime in that period, they crashed, they disappeared.
Yeah, definitely much more abundant than they are nowadays.
Definitely, yeah, that's right. Okay. So I don't know if I'd go so far as to say they were common, but certainly in places they were seen more easily than they are. Certainly more easily than they are now.
Yeah, interesting. Well, look, I mean, I guess hopefully we're going to be getting some more sightings as the months and years progress now and into the future.
So do I hope so too.
Yeah, cool. I did want to ask as well, look, we always do want to get to know our guest a little bit. You started out doing aeronautical eng at the Australian Defence Force Academy, is that correct?
That's not, it's sort of true. And I assume this is part one of a three-part podcast, is it?
This is a long story, is it?
No, when I was a kid, I was always interested in birds, but I wanted to join the Air Force and be a pilot.
Right, so flight, basically.
Yeah, I guess there's a common theme there. So I ended up, I went to the Defence Force Academy, and you weren't allowed to do an aeronautical engineering degree, which was a 4-year degree. If you wanted to be aircrew, you had to do a 3-year degree. So they basically chopped the last year off an aeronautical engineering degree and gave you a Bachelor of Technology in Aeronautical Engineering. I can't, my wife is actually a qualified engineer, and I can't make the claim. I can't say I'm an engineer because she's like, no, you're not, you only did 3 years. So
right, you didn't get that final.
No, that's right. So anyway, the long story short, I didn't end up becoming a pilot. I failed the training and ended up being an air traffic controller, but I was in the Air Force for about 13 years in the end, I think, before I got out. So.
And what drew you back to night parrots? Was it always interested in birds since you were a kid?
I can't, like I said, I can't claim that I was specifically aimed at night parrots my whole life. I quit the Air Force and wanted to go back to birds because that's, I'd always maintained that interest. So I did a grad dip in ecology, and then I did a bit of work as consulting and that sort of stuff, and a bit of bird tourism guiding for like a bird tourism company. And then sort of had sniffed around trying to do a PhD and ended up because I haven't been through the traditional honours sort of pathway.
Right, that whole academic.
Yeah, that's right. I was coming in as a mature age student they call us, and then so because of my background and some experience I had, they were happy to bring me into the program. I actually started on a different project, and I was going on that for about 3 months before my supervisor called me into his office and said, Nick, you don't want to do night parrots, do you? And of course I couldn't say yes fast enough. So.
Yeah, you'd pretty much have to jump at an opportunity.
That's right.
All right, well, very interesting, man. Now, for all of our audience listening at home, I suppose we should talk about Bush Heritage Australia a little bit.
Yep.
So they're a national non-profit organisation conserving local biodiversity, buying and managing land of high conservation value, and working in partnership with landowners to protect native plants and animals. So they have reserves around Australia, millions of hectares of some of the most ecologically important landscapes, often in conjunction with Aboriginal partners, land groups, conservation organisations such as Arid Recovery and local landholders. How did you get involved with them? Are they just part of the Night Parrot project as well?
Yeah, more or less. So when the Night Parrots were rediscovered in Western Queensland in 2013, there was a how do we best conserve these birds was the question, because at the time they're just on private property, they weren't on a protected area or anything like that, so very important to figure out how to protect them. And Bush Heritage came on board. They and I think, I could be corrected here, but I think this was like the first time it's ever happened in the state where they actually excised part of a existing property, the station that the birds were found on. They excised it. It was about, I think it was about 10% of the property, and it was gazetted as a reserve, and Bush Heritage bought that property.
Right.
And for the sole purpose of protecting this, at the time, the only known population of night parrots.
Well, do Bush Heritage, I'm sure they have other reserves in Queensland.
Yeah, they do. So they've got, so I work closely with Alex Cutt, who's their regional manager out in Western Queensland, and they own several reserves out there. So Edgbaston, which protects like some of the freshwater springs, and the redfin blue eye, I think, it's like the little fish that lives out there.
Right.
Craven's Peak, Ethabooka Station, which is both are right over on the border with South Australia and Northern Territory. So, sorry, with the Northern Territory at that point. So yeah, they own a bunch of reserves out in Western Queensland, but they purchased Pullen Pullen specifically because the night parrots were there, and to protect them. So.
And look, that's basically what they do all over the country, right? They've got over 2 million hectares of reserve.
Yeah,
something like that.
I know most about the ones in Western Queensland just because of the area I work in. But yeah, they do certainly have reserves all over the country, and work around a process of sort of trying to raise money. They purchase these properties and then just look to manage them back to an ecologically healthy state. That's really important for them. So, and that's what they've done at Pullen. It now has no. Pullen now has no grazing on it, that sort of thing. So
letting all those grasses grow back, which obviously for
for the night parrot. Well, we don't know, but we think we suspect it's important.
Sure.
So yeah.
No, interesting. And look, I also understand that they're working with traditional owners in helping manage some of the 4 million hectares of indigenous land, providing
landscape
management, conservation programs, vegetation, fire management, and working with those traditional.
Yeah, for sure. So I know
as well.
I know there's some reserves in Western Australia where Bush Heritage have a role, like you say, advising the TOs, the traditional owners of those properties, of how to manage them and that sort of thing. So, really heavily involved in conservation right across the
they seem to
country.
Work across a lot of different barriers and borders.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Donate if you want to help save the night parrot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, they have. We're definitely going to be talking about Pullen Reserve, which is where the night parrot currently is. So we'll also be dropping some details there, so you can donate and have a look at Bush Heritage Reserve, Bush Heritage Australia, for anybody listening at home. All right, onto the night parrot. And again,
sorry, I've just got a mouthful of your delicious
No, that's all right. I'm going to prattle on here a little bit, maybe try to get the name right. Pezoporus occidentalis. Pezoporus?
I've heard Pezoporus and Pezoporus. I'm not sure which is correct, but
it's not porose. It's definitely not porose. Pezoporus. Let's go Pezoporus occidentalis for now. As the Smithsonian Institute says, it's the planet's most elusive bird. It's a relatively small, very secretive, nocturnal, mostly ground-dwelling parrot. Known mostly from spinifex roosts, the tall desert triodia grass species that we have here in arid parts of Australia. Thought to feed on seeding spinifex, but probably also likely on chenopod's, which are the salt bushes, and samphire shrublands, and also quite likely in eucalyptus shrublands and mallee shrublands in the arid zones. A yellowish green bird mottled with dark brown, black, and bright yellow. They produce a croaky contact call, as well as some longer whistles and some ding-ding noises. So you've heard all of those out in the field, obviously.
Yeah. So as I'm sort of saying before, the main way to detect this bird is by hearing it call. Yeah.
So you guys are using bioacoustics over there.
Yeah. Yep. So one of my, my sort of research weapon of choice is the automatic acoustic or automated recording unit, which is like a box that's basically you set it to record, and it records all your sound on a couple of SD cards, and I put them up through the landscape all over the place trying to detect these birds. Because one of the things, so really early on when Steve Murphy, who started the research program soon after the birds were found out there, one of the first things he wanted to try and do was work out how to detect them. What is there a repeatable and efficient way of finding these things? And one of the things that he discovered was that they have this really predictable calling period, and it happens about half an hour after sunset, and it's about an hour to half an hour before sunrise. They they roost in these, like you said, in the dense spinifex. They sort of seem to wake up around sunset, and about half an hour after they start calling, and the calling period is only like 5 or 10 minutes long, sometimes a bit longer if it's been raining or they're breeding, but in dry times it's only, like I said, 5 or 10 minutes. If there's a few, usually in most of the circumstances we've found the birds, there's a pair or maybe 3 or 4 birds in a, spread across a small area of, each bird might be separated by 100 metres or something like that. And they wake up and, they call to each other, and it's, the common calls you hear are like this, like a dink dink, and then they seem to like call back to each other for a bit, and then they'll seem to fly. Obviously you can't see any of this happening because it's pretty much dark, but you're sort of imagining what's going on because of where you hear the sounds. But then they'll fly, and they often sort of seem to meet up close to each other on the ground, and then they'll give this little croaky call, which sounds like a little frog. It sounds more like I don't know, some of your listeners might be familiar with the dwarf tree frog.
Eastern
tree
dwarf
frog, yeah.
Yeah, right. We were actually out in the field, recording a bunch of their calls in Coral Forest recently.
Exactly. It sounds a lot like one of them. So it's like a reek, 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 reek.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's when they say croak. That's actually, that's
more of a ribbit.
Yeah, sort of. So they'll do that, and that's sort of like when you hear that call, it usually means that there's 2 birds quite close together, or it's like like inside voice, so they're close to each other, and then and then after that, usually they go quiet. Presumably that's when they fly off to feed and do all that sort of stuff. And then it happens in reverse in the morning. They come back, you'll just be sitting there, it'll be quiet, then you'll hear one, you'll hear the other, then they'll call back to each other for a few minutes, and then
have a little chat before they go to bed.
Before they go to bed. Yeah. So that's it. So but they have and so this is not really surprising given they're nocturnal. So if you think about it, like most parrots are visual sort of animals. That's why they're brightly coloured. They see each other. That's what colours mean in nature. That it's a visual thing. So this is a visual bird that doesn't actually get to see its its friends that often. So it makes sense that they still want to be social. Yeah, and the way they do that is through calling and having this really regular calling. And they have a really one of the things that's sort of doing my head in is the wide variety of calls that they have. I'm still out there now after a year hearing calls and going, oh, that's a new one I didn't know. So
wow.
I wonder if I've heard that before and didn't know it was a night parrot.
So there is some. Do they have some fairly unique individual calls as well, or is it a bit hard to tell?
It's really hard to tell. The thing that constrains us with this bird is that it comes out at night, and you can't do all the usual things that you would do. So you can't band them and just see, oh, that's the guy with the red band on his left leg, and that's the one with the blue band on his right leg. So we know they're different individuals. You can't do any of that. Yeah. You can sort of there's spots where you hear like a similar combination of calls, and you assume that's the same 2 individuals night after night. So what we're pretty confident of is that these birds permanently occupy a spot for a long period. And so when you go back to a period time and time again, you get, okay, this one will start calling over there first, and this one will start calling over there, and it'll have this call, and this one will have that call. And sometimes you're out there and it's like, oh, that's a bit different. Has he moved, or have they moved, or is there a new bird here? But it's usually pretty regular and pretty predictable, the sorts of sounds that you hear. But it's hard because there's, like I said, there's 2 sites, particularly at Pull and Pullen, that are about 5 k's apart from each other, that are both have been occupied for a long time, and the calls we hear at one site are quite different to the calls we hear at the other. They're both just groups of night parrots. We don't know whether that's to do with different. They could be different social groups. Is it we knew at one time, we knew one was a pair trying to breed. We knew another pair was a pair that had some, relatively well-developed young ones. Is the difference in calling to do with where they are in their, reproduction cycle or something? And like I said, these are all questions we can have, but that we have no hope of answering.
Yeah, wow. That's fascinating. Like, it is very interesting that you guys are out there, recording all this data and then obviously running it through analysis programs to kind of pick them up.
Yeah, trying to. That's the... sorry, I can't stop eating this.
No, get into it. That's fine.
That's our main way of tracking long-term trends in the population. So we have... So at the sites that we know are permanently occupied, we have a permanent sound recorders set up there, and they just record
basically on a telegraph pole ready to go.
Not even. They're just sort of set up quite low to the ground because we know that the birds as I sort of was saying before, when they wake up, they do some flying back and forth low over the spin effect. So something that we're always really conscious of is putting like an obstacle there that they can fly into, and I don't want to.
Yeah, don't want to. Put up a knock.
I don't want to kill
20% of the night time that they don't know is there.
Knock off 20% of the known night parrot population in one incident. Yeah, so trying to keep stuff low down.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are there recording every single night, and we can go back and listen to that and go, yep, the birds were there, they were there every night, sort of thing. Or we can, in a couple of circumstances, is actually enabled us to go, oh, okay, these birds were here until this point, calling at this sort of rate, and then over the course of a couple of weeks or something, the calling rate decreased, and then suddenly they weren't there anymore. So that presumably that means those birds have now moved. Yeah. And in one circumstance, we know that correlated with starting to hear calls at another site. So we presume that this group of birds moved from that site to that site. But these are the sorts of
stuff that needs a bit of GPS mapping on it.
Yeah, the sort of stuff you're trying to just bits of the puzzle you get that you're trying to put together and work out what it means. But
well, it's fascinating to hear, like, even just the fact that you guys are recording so much audio, and you've got populations now that you're kind of trying to, or at least social groups, little communities. For our audience who don't know, the night parrot was declared extinct for a long time. So, I mean, this may just be largely due to how cryptic it is.
Yeah.
But it was first recorded by Western Science in 1845. And then the last living specimen was collected in 1912 in WA. And it was basically thought extinct until a possible sighting in 1979. And again, early naturalists have noted that, feral cats were, fairly likely to be one of the culprits. A lot of areas, they say that they were lost fairly quickly after feral cats arrived in the area. But look, there was very few sightings even after 1979. There was one roadkill in 1990, 3 sightings at Minga Well in the WA Pilbara region during a mining survey, but no photos. Then 2006, some Diamantina National Park rangers find one dead in the barbed wire, and I guess at the time hope was pretty high for rediscovery. That's quite a few little sightings in like the 90s there. Yeah,
it's the story of the night parrot over time is so fascinating. So I'll pick you up on one thing though. It was some people postulated that it might be extinct,
right?
But no one. When you look back in the literature and you look through the sightings, most people thought it was out there somewhere. It was just that no one was ever able to get, like you said, like a photo,
right,
or a, the bar for, because it had been so long since the bird had been certainly recorded, the bar was set pretty high to get that. So and this is the thing I find most interesting going back through the literature. There's these records from people who, pretty much from the early 1900s, when it was, first known to be sort of have disappeared. There's records from people, but these were not bird watchers. These were, jackaroos,
right,
or, TOs, like TOs on their land out in
so again, these
Australia.
word of mouth potential sightings.
That's right. But some of these sightings, when you read the detail in them, it's clear that they'd seen a night parrot. I was riding along on my horse, and my horse kicked this spinifex hummock, and this green parrot with a black speckly back flew out and then dived back into the spinifex, and while it did it went rit rit rit, like made this croaky sound, and you're like, well, that's a night parrot.
Yeah,
that's the only thing it can be. But like I said, because the bar was set so high, none of these people were ornithologists. No one believed them. And if you go back through the literature, there's good records of night parrots from pretty much every decade. Ever since they were discovered. So.
Did they get more infrequent though?
They certainly got more infrequent. So we know, like I said, they were recorded relatively regularly in the late 1800s, but then clearly they went off a cliff. There was this big decrease in the number of sightings, and the fact that people couldn't go and see them by choice, sort of thing. Like it was the sort of bird back in the late 1800s. If you really wanted to see it, you could go somewhere on.
Well, not late 1800s. Yeah, you might need some gunpowder and a store.
That's
stand,
right.
But,
That's right. If you wanted to get one, there was probably a way to go and do it.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the case. So,
Sure.
so no one. I don't think people thought they were extinct, but certainly we knew that they declined severely. The interesting thing about the 1979 sighting is that was the first one that was by an ornithologist, and that was by a renowned ornithologist called Shane Parker, who was the curator of birds at the South Australian Museum, and he was targeting the night parrot. They were on it. He set up a camel expedition out through the Kunji Lakes area of northeastern South Australia, targeting samphire and that sort of chenopod habitat that we know the birds had occurred in previously. And while on that expedition, they flushed what I think was 3 parrots from a clump of lignum, I think it was, on the edge of like a salt lake or something like that. So, and you know, when Shane Parker says, "I've seen a night parrot," everyone sort of went, "Well, that was probably a night parrot."
Yeah,
so
right.
he never, I think this is right, I think Shane unfortunately passed away not long after that sighting, so he never
had time to publish it.
Never had time to publish it. It was known, it was well known that he'd sent, and it's been published by other people on the expedition, but Shane himself never actually got to publish the specific details. But that, but everyone understands. Yeah, that was a pretty. You know, we don't think that was a good record.
So look, they were out there, but
they're out there, but just really low numbers, and you just had to be lucky to find one. Really.
So nocturnal cryptic parrot. Taking a massive population hit, it's going to be hard to find.
Yeah, I can't tell you how cryptic this thing is. Like I've been working out there for a year now, and I am regularly in and around sites where I know the birds are. I'm obviously very careful not to disturb them because that's, ethically, that's just not, that's what I have to do because it's, very rare. This is my only population I can study at the moment. Yeah. So I'm obviously not trying to disturb them, but even still in that time, I've only seen it 3 or 4 times. I know where I hear it every night, but I've only seen it that handful of times. So that just gives you some idea of how hard they are to actually see. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Look, I guess it was 2013 then when John Young, ecologist and wildlife filmmaker, released 17 seconds of film. Plus some roost site feathers, which were taken to the WA Museum for DNA analysis from the Lake Eyre Basin in South Australia, and that was kind of the first confirmed rediscovery.
Yeah, so that's not quite right. So where John found them, that was the site, that was Pullen Pullen.
Okay.
So where he rediscovered them, that was Pullen Pullen, and that's where I do my work.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, I mean, a tremendous. It's probably one of the ornithological feats of the century by John Young to find this thing, and let's be clear, lots of people have been out looking and
nobody's been able to pull it off.
No one had pulled it off, but for him to actually to not only to find them but to get a photo, that was
massive hats off there. Hey?
Yeah, that was the proof that that we were looking for, I suppose, to know that they were out there. So and look, that's what's precipitated everything since then. That's all turned on that one discovery by John, which was And I wouldn't be here talking to you about night parrots
if it wasn't for that.
If it wasn't for John getting out and doing that.
Yeah, good on him, hey. And look, obviously since then, a lot more work going down at Pullen Pullen. Is Steve Murphy's is that his research site as well, mostly down there?
Yeah, so the way it worked after John discovered the birds, there was a sort of acceptance that there needed to be some sort of heavy hitting scientific research done into it. And it coincided at the time with, so you actually just mentioned the sighting in the Pilbara, the Minga Well sighting, and that sighting was while the ecologists that made that sighting were doing some work on land owned by Fortescue Metals, and they made that sighting. And so part of an environmental condition attached to one of the Fortescue mine expansions over there was that they had to spend $1 million on night parrot research.
Wow.
And that coincided very nicely with the discovery of these birds in Western Queensland. Oh. And so it made sense. Fortescue contracted Steve, who's a rangeland ecologist of significant experience, and had done a lot of his own sort of research into night parrots and historical records. So he was, he knew quite a lot about the history of the bird. So he got contracted to do that work and started a scientific research program at what is now Pullen Pullen. At the time, it was just a pastoral station. Yeah. And he started that I think it was the end of 2013, and went for basically 2014, 15, 16 for 3 years. That was how long that project went for. And my work is essentially we just tag team. So Steve said, I've got it this far. Nick, off you go.
Pass it on to you.
But I talk to Steve all the time, probably too much. He's probably sick of me. I'm essentially just keeping that. It's just been considered one big long research project started started with John's discovery, followed and then got going with Steve's research, and now just me following up.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. And so it was 2015 that Steve and his partner Rachel Barr tagged Pedro.
Yeah.
A live individual down in Pullen.
Yeah, it was. So that was... So up till that point, Steve had been concentrating mainly on trying to, like I said, that detection stuff, like getting lots of recordings and that sort of thing. But then what we didn't know at that point was what the birds did. Like there was a thought that maybe they just, did they just live in the spin effects? Did they just wake up and sort of walk out of their little tunnel
and then feed on the grass there and then go back in?
And then walk back in? No one knew. We had no idea. So, and you can't protect a bird unless you know what it does. So, and they put camera traps all through there trying to detect that happening to see if that they could pick them up on that. And Steve's got something, just a tiny one. I've got to pick the kids up from daycare in an hour or two. So
we got some more cake and we'll be hanging out for a little bit before we put you back on the road.
So maybe with the camera traps they'd be able to detect what they were doing, and in something like 15,000 camera trap images, there's one of a night parrot. So okay, well that doesn't work. We know we can detect them by sound. We've got to find out what they're doing at night. And so they tagged one, and I think they named that first one Pedro. It probably should have been, I don't know, Pedrita, because it turned out to be a female. But it's
always the way it goes when you're naming a young animal that grows up into a different one.
That's right. So they tagged Pedro with a radio, with just a radio tag. And so for your listeners, it's sort of, if you're not familiar, you can overestimate how much data you get from these. All this thing really does is allow you, if you're within a certain distance of it, to get a direction on it.
So it's basically the transceiver thing. If you're listening at home, imagine walking around with a TV antenna.
Exactly.
And you do a 360-degree circle, and at a certain point you're going to hear some pinging in a set of headphones that you have attached to the transceiver. That's kind of what you get. It's
that's
some more pings as you get closer to pointing it in the right direction. I mean, I know that there's certain things you can put data loggers from internal that will give you more pings depending on the body temperature of the animal and such. But I'm guessing you weren't putting big data loggers inside these.
Exactly. So at this point, like, ethics was a huge consideration, because remember at this point there was still only just these parrots were only known from a couple of sites, but the importance of doing this was they have to know what they're doing to conserve them properly. So they went conservative and just put on basically the smallest transmitter they could. And exactly like you said, with the TV antenna, okay, that means it's in this direction, and then you sort of got to get closer. And Steve and Rach thought what they might be able to do is get close to it and then watch it through some night vision goggles or something like that. It turned out that this bird would wake up. It would spend a little bit of time in the roost, which they knew because they would hear the calls and that sort of stuff. And then it would disappear, and they knew it was flying in like a general direction, and then they'd go in that direction and never found it again overnight. But then in the morning, she would always come back to the same spot, and they just didn't know where it was going. They knew it was going in a general direction and presumably a long way.
Right.
So not a whole lot of data, but then they repeated it a year later, and this time they put a slightly larger tag on. And this tag had a little GPS receiver on it. Right,
is that the 2017 paper?
So
movements and habitat use of the night parrot in southwest Queensland.
Yep, exactly. So that was in 2016, as almost a year after the radio tracking one, they put the little GPS logger on it. And this one was a male, so he went about his business for about a week, and then they got the tag back and downloaded it. And it was revelatory. Like, this was just amazing information about this bird. And what it showed was that they're actually travelling huge distances at night.
Turns out they're not just popping out of the spin effects and popping back in.
No, definitely not. He was there. So it's sort of it's hard to explain just using words. It's much easier to explain if I can draw a picture. But basically, the way this GPS tag works is it's not like continuous, like you don't get like this snail trail of where the bird went for the whole 7 days. What you get is a bunch of little dots on a map, and you can program the receiver. Because it's so small, it only has about 500 seconds of battery life. And so you only can get about 100 fixes, and you program the receiver when it wakes up and takes those fixes. So they programmed it to wake up for about 2 hours at the start of the night, for about 7 nights in a row, and then at different times during the night, just for a 2-hour period, and it'd get a fix every 5 minutes during that 2-hour period.
Right.
So, and because it worked over that sort of, I think they got about 5 days worth of data in the end. They were able to, like I said, you sort of put that together, and it's a bit like a join the dots. Like, okay, in this 2 hours, the dots went here, and that it is sort of like a snail trail for that 2 hours. Right. But then you don't know what he did the rest of the night, and then the next night, you know, okay, for this 2 hours, you know, we had it on from 10 till midnight last night. This night it was on from midnight till 2 in the morning. We know that in that period he did this. So over a 5-day period, you put all these together and you can sort of see the area that it's working in.
Right. And then they were doing vegetation mapping, vegetation surveys.
Yeah, so
of the sites where you were getting GPS fixes to understand why it was going to those locations.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, in a couple of these 2-hour periods that it was tagged, like all the dots were just within like a few meters of each other, which obviously tells you this bird is on the ground, presumably feeding. And those spots were sort of where you'd expect a parrot to be. Like one of them was on this floodplain with, you know, lots of seeding grasses. Other spots were in these little, you get lots of sort of ironstone residual sort of plains out there, and they have these really shallow depressions. And when I say shallow, like you're talking about relief of only, you know, a couple of centimetres maybe, but just enough in that landscape to collect just a little bit more water, collect a few seeds when it's blowing, and you get these little, you know, little plants and extra grass growing around them. And in the middle of this, what looks like a completely barren landscape in a lot of places, it was feeding on these areas. So, yeah, Stephen Rach and a girl called Jen Silcock, who's a sort of a rangeland botany Jedi. She went out there and helped Stephen Rach, and that was, like I said, that's some of the best data we've got from that little paper there about what these birds do, and what it shows, we think, is that the spinifex is important for the roosting, but then in the landscape, these little productive areas are really important, and that's where they go to feed at night. And we know that they're travelling, like I said, putting together those dots, you can work out that these birds are travelling at least 40 kilometres some night. Which is a
massive change compared to what people thought they
what we thought they might do, exactly. And also, and the truth is that 40 kilometres is probably an underestimate. You know, they're probably travelling quite a bit further in each night as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so amazing.
Yeah, and fantastic stuff. And so, look, obviously, there was a fair bit learnt from the radio tracking, but you're getting so much more with those GPS fixes about the habitat 100%, use. 100%.
Yeah,
that's fantastic work. Very, very interesting. Yeah. And look, I guess with all of this new ecological stuff, there's going to be hopefully more sightings coming up. Obviously, quite a few this year already. There was the photos from WA by a group of ornithologists, including Neil Hamilton, in an, of course, undisclosed rocky spinifex location.
I've been to this undisclosed rocky spinifex location.
You have? Fantastic. There was also the recent photo by the Paku Indigenous Rangers from camera traps in the Great Sandy Desert Spinifex country. So, you know, okay, we've got this pretty big range extension, that change in habitat. You know, they're not just in spinifex, they're moving to these sandfire and kenopod type of habitats, particularly, you know, when they're feeding at nighttime. You know, and, you know, we're now finding them in WA as well.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I've been to the sighting from Western Australia from earlier this year. That was in March, April. That was by a group of 4 birders: Nigel Jackett, Bruce Greatwich, George Swan, and Adrian Boyle. They went out, and so Neil Hamilton is actually a guy who's done a lot of work in Central Australia, thought a lot about night parrots, and he'd talked to Bruce and these guys and given them some tips on an area that he thought would be good for them to search in. They went and searched, and sure enough, got this great photo of this night parrot. And so I've actually since been to that site and heard the birds there, and it's really interesting because it is quite similar. While it's different it looks quite different to the site in Queensland. Ecologically, you can see how it's similar. So they've got lots of old growth, long unburnt spinifex that the birds can live in. But you have these, they're all part of these, they're called Paleo drainage systems. A lot of people just call them salt lakes. And so they're like these really ancient shallow depressions in the landscape, collect just a little bit more nutrients and a little bit than
like
the
surrounding
surrounding
gilgais and stuff that we have out in Western Queensland.
It's sort of like a large scale version of a gilgai almost, but. And so in the sort of beds of these, you get quite a diverse grasses and, like I said, ctenopods, samphires, that sort of stuff. And so what we think there is that the birds probably don't have to travel as far as they do in Queensland. If you can imagine, in Western Australia, the habitats seem to be sort of intrinsic. So you get the spinifex that forms the rings and the really complex structure on these salt lake systems, as well as what they feed. And so those two are always, they're, like I said, they're sort of intrinsically linked.
Right.
Whereas if you imagine in Queensland,
they're going to fly up to the Ironstone Mountains or out to the floodplains.
Yeah, so where the spinifex is and where the birds feed are not linked in any way. So what you're looking for in Queensland is a site where these two ecosystems come in close proximity to each other.
Yeah, right.
Whereas in Western Australia, like I said, they just happen to be in close proximity to each other. That's the way the landscape works. So that's the interesting thing about where those guys found that bird in central Western Australia. The one with the parakeet guys up in further north in Western Australia, not quite to the Kimberley, it's like just off the southern edge of it, but it's similar. It's this, like I said, old growth spinifex with these sort of productive, drainage systems nearby that probably support a bit more, like I said, just a bit more grass, a little bit more, feed than the surrounding landscape, and that's probably what supports the birds there. With this, obviously we've got a bit of a better understanding of where they are. Like we're talking about these areas where you've got, the feed grasses and the spinifex grasses. Yep.
With all of this new knowledge, do you think that we're going to be seeing more and more of these sightings? Or does it really take the amount of effort on the ground?
Yeah, it's the $64 million question. I think there's a temptation out there, and I think there was a temptation certainly early in the research program to think that with that we'd just find the key, and that once we had the key, these things would pop up all over the place. So I'm pretty convinced that in Western Queensland, that I think we have the key, which is knowing what they sound like. And I've done a lot of looking for birds in Western Queensland, and they're not popping up all over the place. Yeah, okay. So I think in Western Queensland, I think they're genuinely rare. I think we're talking about just a small handful of birds in what might be relatively marginal night parrot habitat. Like I said, you're talking about this having to have these productive areas and this roosting habitat just happen to be in close proximity to each other. Right. And whereas in Western Australia, we know that it's sort of different. So we know now that we can target these drainage systems a bit more, look for the old growth spinifex, look for the areas that might be a bit more productive, and get a bit more. And there's more of that in Western Australia than there is of what potentially we think is suitable habitat in Queensland. So I think there's going to be more birds in Western Australia. Also, that northwest corner is a bit more, a bit less explored. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, so Western Queensland still was relatively unexplored as well. So I certainly think that's part of it. That's why they're not being found, because it is remote. But I still think in Western Australia there'll be more. But so this site where these guys found them in Western Australia in March, it's a big site. It's the area of spinifex is sort of 4 or 5 k's long and a couple of k's wide. And you look at it, you get there and you think, if there's a pair of night parrots here, if there's 2, there's got to be 10. Yeah, right. And I spent a month there listening every morning, every night, and we only ever heard 2 birds in this one little spot. Yeah, right. So I think what that tells us is that while there's certainly more habitat in Western Australia, there's certainly more night parrots there, but I don't think it's going to be a case of we know now and we'll find lots of them. I think we're still going to look. I think we're going to look in a lot of places and not find them. We will find them in more places, but we'll not find them in a lot more places than we do find them.
Is there something about their breeding ecology that makes the populations so small, other than just the fact that they've been hit that heavily?
Yeah, it's really hard to know. It's
for 3-4 eggs is the estimate?
Yeah, so
3 to 6. depending on who you talk to?
Yeah, depends who does depend who you talk to. So I've seen a few nests now. I've seen 2 or 3 eggs in the nests that I've seen. But it's look at the problem with the night parrot is where our knowledge base is still, like I said, we really want to reinforce this to everyone that's listening. Our knowledge base is still so low compared to most other birds. Like we just don't know. One thing we do know about the birds in Pullen is that they've been trying to breed quite a bit because they had really good conditions out there in 2016, a lot of rain. And for most of a lot of 2016 and also a lot of this year, the birds have been trying to breed. We know that they lay eggs. Sometimes the eggs get knocked off, so there's a case where they got eaten by the mulga snake. We know, which is just fascinating to me. Yeah, for sure.
You've got the rarest bird in the world being predated by a nice common king brunette.
Yeah, that's right. So there was that. We know that this pair that we've watched nesting a few times in Pullen often get birds to fledge, but then we only know 2 times out of, I think we're up to like 7 or 8 breeding attempts that we've actually been able to sort of monitor and know have a reasonable idea of what the outcome is. Of the 8 of those attempts, only 2 of them have got birds to fledge that have lasted for more than a few months. We know a couple of times they've fledged birds and then 3 weeks later the same pair is back on a nest with eggs. So we assume that the young ones got predated by goannas, snakes, cats,
everything out there that's predating them.
And you see, once I've seen one of these really young birds when it's just out of the nest, and these things they're just fast food.
It's a snack.
It is. It's not. They're helpless.
Yeah.
There's plenty of predators out there that can knock them off. So
now when you say that you saw 2 cases of successful fledging, was that the whole nest or was that just some individuals?
No. So we know that. These sort of this pair that we know have nested a few times. When I say fledgling, like young birds have left the nest.
Okay.
But then there's only twice do we know of evidence of young birds still being in the area sort of a couple of months later.
Right.
In most cases.
Good survivorship, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what we know in most of the cases is that they get the young out of the nest, and then, like I said, 3 or 4 weeks later, this pair is back on the nest with eggs or something.
Yeah.
And the assumption there is that the young ones haven't made it. I mean, they might be independent after 4 or 5 weeks, but that seems very unlikely.
Wow, there's a lot of challenges there. I mean, it seems to be a pretty kind of all of them seem to be struggling at the same time.
Yeah, well, hard to. I mean, like I said, your sample size is tiny.
True.
We've got
7 nesting.
And you have to be so careful around these birds because you can't. Like I said, you can't do all these things that you would do for a normal bird. You can't just sit there and watch it. You can't go and check the nest every day. You just sort of have to. All right, I know they're nesting. I can put a sound recorder near it, and then I just have to, just wait and see what happens, and see if I get any evidence, make what conclusions I can. I can't be in there, like I said, actively disturbing, doing active research. It all has to be passive, which limits the conclusions you can make.
Yeah, but very challenging. But hey, I mean, it's got to be done right as well. I mean, we're working to conserve them, so don't want to put any more unnecessary pressure on them, right?
It's just it's just going to be. It is what it is. It's just going to be a slowly putting together these tiny bits of the puzzle over time, and we'll eventually get there, but we're not going to get there in my PhD.
The next person that you pass the ball on to.
Me, that's right.
Well, look, you're kicking the ball further down the road anyway, and kicking some goals along the way. So
a little bit further down the road.
A little bit. Well, look, we better move on here to a bit of a new segment. We normally do our new research and kind of just move on to whatever new research is kind of in and around, but we're actually really going to focus on the night parrot here. There's 2 fantastic papers out by Stephen Murphy. First of all, we've got Murphy et al. 2017. Observations on night parrots, Pezoporus occidentalis in Western Queensland. That's from volume 177, issue 2 of EMU, the Australian Ornithology Journal. So this was obviously at Pullen Reserve out there in southwest Queensland. Sorry, what? Central Western Queensland? Southwest? Central West?
It depends.
Kind of on the borderline, isn't it?
I say Western Queensland.
Okay, let's just say Western Queensland.
Yeah.
So this was several breeding attempts observed by pairs, breeding pairs on site, with nest and fledgling descriptions, habitat and clutch characteristics, breeding seasonality, vocalizations as well. And of course that case of a nest predation by a mulga snake. So this was pretty much all nesting observations, correct?
Yeah, yep. So this was, so Steve and Rachel were doing their research out there, like I said, from late 2013. Sort of summer 2016 or early 2016 was really wet. I think it was 2016 is almost the wettest year on record out there.
Wow.
And so you'll remember that, so the when they GPS tagged the bird, that was in May 2016. So just before that, Steve was at one of the sites where the birds were, and he was walking sort of, I can't remember why, he was walking near a clump of spinifex on dusk, and a night parrot flew up out of it and landed right next to it. And that's really odd, because usually again, I say usually based on a sample size of 3 or whatever, but the few times I've flushed them, they pop up and they'll fly like a distance before diving back in. This one popped up and just like landed basically next to where it came out of, and watched him for a few seconds before sort of flying away up the hill. He thought, oh, that's odd. And so he checked where it came out of, and sure enough, there was a nest. So with a couple of eggs in it. So it
was a little bit hesitant to abandon straight away, maybe.
Yeah. So
rather than flying straight away from the nest, it popped out to kind of, hey, what's going on?
Just so this is you're
making some assumptions.
No, but you're right. So when you're in the field, these things happen. You're like, oh, that sort of is different to what usually happens. I wonder why that is. Yeah, that's what ecology is about. And so so Steve quickly, see where that came from, and sure enough, like I said, there was a nest with eggs in there.
Well, it's like any scientist. Anomaly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right. So they found the nest. So quickly, straight away, he sort of got out of there, because you don't want to cause any disturbance. And then a couple of things they did. They put one of these acoustic recorders close to the nest. And then they had some night vision gear, and they watched the nest from quite a distance away, but only for short periods, because they didn't want to disturb it. So they and they got about 3 or 4 days of observations, and they would see, it seemed like they assumed it was the female sitting on the nest, and then the male would sort of come and when the calling, like I said, that half an hour after sunset, the male would come and call to her, and they'd call back, and then they'd leave, presumably to go feeding. So after about 3 or 4 days, I think it was, there was some odd behaviour, like there was lots more calling than usual. I thought, something might have gone wrong here. And they went and checked the nest, and sure enough, the eggs were in there, but they were smashed. And that was, so they didn't know why at the time, but obviously the nest had failed, so they collected some fragments of the egg, and then took some measurements around the nest, and then used that to do a bit of searching in the surrounding area, and they found a couple of other, what they think were probably old nests, and one of them had the remains of a chick in there that was presumably a night parrot, and they were, I think this is right, they found that, but then it started raining, and basically they got this torrential downpour, and this has happened to me out there before. You get a torrential downpour,
and everything turns to slop.
You can't get back there for a week, because roads are cut, it's too muddy, all that sort of thing.
I've been in a vehicle out on some of those red roads with some corner people, some herp nerds, and a little bit of rain, and even at 20k, you can 180 a car very easy.
No, that's exactly right. So basically they couldn't go back there for about a week. They eventually went back, collected the stuff out of the nest, took some measurements and that sort of thing, and that was, but then were able to analyse the data off the recorder, and got a whole bunch of different calls that they had not heard before, that they presumably are associated with breeding. So that was in April 2016. When I started doing my research out there in October, we were at this site, and we knew the pair were there, and we were interested to see if they were trying to breed again. So we were searching for the nest, because like I said, we know what they look like. They're really quite distinctive, how they make them in the spinifex.
Yeah, a little hummock tussle tunnel thing into the...
Yeah, so if you, I don't know if your listeners can know what sort of spinifex looks like, but you have, it's like this big spiky sort of hummock. Imagine it's like a big bean bag, but it's spiky grass. And when they get really big, they form these rings. And the birds, when they're roosting during the day, they build a tunnel at ground level, just in under the edge of the spinifex. That's what they hang out in. But their nests, they actually start above the ground, so it's like a tunnel into the side of the imagine a tunnel that's not at ground level, but halfway up the side of the beanbag.
It's into the side of the tussock, basically.
Yeah, but it descends down to the ground, and that's where the chamber is on the ground. So we were looking for these nests because they look like they're quite easy to find. While we're looking for one of these nests, we flushed a fledgling, and that was so I think that was in the news at the time, and we got a photo of it. But of course, we did the same thing. As soon as we saw that, we just ran away and backed off. And then we couldn't actually find where the nest was. We knew that there was 2 fledglings because we waited till dusk, and from a fair distance away, about 100 metres away, we could hear these different. We could hear the birds calling, and this sound that we presumed was the fledglings. We hear a couple of them. So. That was how that was what was included in that paper. Since then, at that same site, I went back a few weeks later, and we found where the nest was. And at the time, the birds had relayed and actually had a couple of nestlings in there. And we think that was evidence that probably the fledgling we'd seen, 4 weeks earlier or so, had probably not made it, because they would have, for the nest to be as progressed as far as it was, they would have been relaying within a week or so of us seeing them.
Rather than keeping the same fledgling. Yeah,
that's right. So that's the sort of the assumption, and we also assume that it's the same pair.
Yeah.
Based on what we know from the area, that's that's pretty safe assumption. So, but anyway, this pair we know have tried to breed another 3 or 4. I think in total about 5 or 6 times since that first attempt in April 2016.
And not having a lot of success.
No, so a couple of times they've fledged birds. We think they've finally got a bird to fledgling. Like I said, they got birds to fledgling at least 3 times that we know of. But we think only one of them survived in more than just a couple of months, because when we were out there only a few weeks ago at that same site, we actually saw a bird, and you can tell when they're young because they're really grey, and this bird was grey but starting to turn green.
And so we're starting to get some of that adult coloration.
Yeah, so so what we do here is we compare to ground parrot, which is the night parrot's closest relative, and we know from their plumage progression that the young ones start grey and then they become green, and based on the timing of that, we think this night parrot was probably 4 or 5 months old, which would mean it's a successful fledgling from a nesting event we know happened in about July. So that's and that there, my friend, is everything we know about nesting night parrots.
Well, I mean, that's not a whole lot of observations. What's that, 5, 6?
Yeah. I suppose, one interesting thing I should say there is that Steve's assumption was that the nesting event he first found, the one that got predated by the mulga snake, was clearly in response to a rain event.
Yeah,
and that's all we thought. Oh, maybe these things just don't breed until there's rain. The most interesting thing about the events, so we know of, like I said, 3 different attempts throughout 2017, is that there has been no rain in 2017, or very little rain in 2017, and they were still breeding. So we think instead of it being in response to a direct response to rain, it's probably a resource availability thing, and we think that the rain event in 2016 was so major
that there's still there's seeds everywhere.
Exactly. There's still enough resources now, whereas a small rain event after a long dry period might be enough for them to try once, but then they'll probably quit. So,
well, look, I was going to say, I mean, it's not a lot of observations, but when it's something that doesn't have any observations, every one of them is very, very significant, right?
That's what someone was telling me the other day. Zoe Stone, a friend of mine at the uni who researches eastern bristlebirds, the northeastern subspecies. There's only about 40 individuals, and she says, my sample size is actually really large because my sample size is the entire population instead of
yeah, it's nice and easy to manage.
Yeah, that's right. Instead of I don't know that I'm making judgments based on a small percentage of the population. I am making my judgment based on a measurement of every population. So maybe it's the same with night parrots.
Let's hope not. Let's hope there's more than 40 out there.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, and our next paper, again from Stephen Murphy et al., movements and habitat use of the night parrot in southwest Queensland. So this is what we were talking about with Pedro and the radio track, and then the GPS tagging for another 5 days in 2016. And then, of course, studying the movements and habitat use, doing veg surveys to describe the feeding grounds of the GPS pings to make some dietary inferences.
Yep.
And obviously going from their roost site to their feeding sites, which are much more floristically diverse?
Yeah, definitely. So this is just fantastic ecology, and it makes so much sense when you read the paper and you see the landscape.
Yeah,
like I said, initially we didn't know whether these birds were just hanging around in the triodia, in the spinifex, but what this shows is that not only are they out moving around the landscape, but they're targeting these floristically diverse patches of landscape. Yeah. So, and out there's not a lot of there's certain topographical features which cause these. Like I said, the depressions, little run-on areas, small depressions, little floodplains, and that sort of thing. Some of them they're nearly all ephemeral. Some of them are more ephemeral than others. Yeah. The question that this paper raised, so when Stephen Raich did this tracking, as I said, in early 2016, the GPS tracking, that was after a wet period. So presumably lots of resources. So what we really need to do is do it again, and this is what we're hoping to do next year, is repeat the tracking, but when it's dry. Right. And see whether the birds are visiting the same areas, and is it like a resource pulse that that lasts a long time and the birds can just survive on that pulse until the next one? Right. Or do they actually go to completely different places when it's dry? Do they perhaps move into creek lines, or do they move into these areas that we think they avoid? Yeah, right.
Because I understand that a lot of those seed banks will survive for several generations there on the ground and in the soil without germinating until for sure. Conditions are correct.
And particularly out in this area. So this is this is a boom bust type of, that's the ecology of the place. So these plants,
much of Australia.
Yeah, exactly. So these plants, they drop their seed, and it might be, years until the next rain or the next good rain. So
or it might only be 2-3 years until the night parrot comes along.
That's
has
right.
himself a little feed.
That's right. So we know that there's a seed bank clearly there. The question is, how accessible is it to something like the parrot? So some of the historical specimens have have dirt in their bills, and some people have suggested that means they actually dig a bit for seeds. Right. Does that happen? Or, like I said,
could have just been a dirty specimen.
Could have been. Or is it, like I said, in dry periods that actually go, so there's all these like ironstone jump ups with completely different vegetation up at the top. Do they fly into there and try and get something like it? This is a question we just don't know the answer to.
Well, I know we call it a ground dwelling parrot, but from the GPS, it's flying up to 41 kilometres a night, a 3,000 hectare home range, effectively. So, that's not insignificant.
No, it's covering a huge area, that's for sure. And like I said, presumably there's enough resources in that area for this bird. I find it really interesting because it says to me that resources aren't the thing that's limiting the bird. Like It seems like I should probably clarify that.
Well, look, if they have the ability to disperse that far and they're not doing it, then presumably something's keeping them there other than resource limitation.
Yeah, that's right. Or something's suppressing the population other than resource. Yeah. So, is that threats? Is that cats or something? Yeah, that's what we're trying to.
Grazing pressure, climate, cats, whatever it is.
But that's the really interesting thing from this. It showed that one of the sites that this bird was feeding on was like a floodplain, like a mitchell that gets lots of mitchell grass and chenopod's, and also this other particular grass called Euranthecium, which has a really big seed on it. And we think that's probably what they were targeting. But this is also this is the land that the graziers, like the floodplains, is where the graziers out that way make their money. So it's also interesting too, because what it tells us is that if these habitats are important for the night parrot, that are also important for the graziers, we can't go out there and just every time we find night parrots just buy the property and knock all the graziers out. That's not going to happen. So what we actually have to do is study, get right into the nitty gritty of what does grazing do to these systems? Does that impact the night parrot? Is there a way of managing it so that the night parrot, so that everyone can live together? Could it be that because it's such a boom bust thing that maybe the night parrot, maybe grazing doesn't bother the night parrot that much, right? Or maybe it only has to be, you only have to manage grazing in just like a short period after a wet. After a wet
to
or
give
something.
Them that pulse.
Yeah, give them the pulse to drop the seed, and then have at it. Let the cows eat all they want as long as the seed gets to the ground or something like that. These are all questions.
All questions that we don't yet know.
That we don't yet know. That's right.
Man, fascinating stuff. I think we're going to have to almost leave it there soon. I suppose we should just talk quickly some of the challenges that they have. Obviously, we've been talking about feral cats, and we were talking with John Wojnarski the other day as well. Basically, they're an ideal prey item, being that sort of small to medium-sized ground-dwelling, ground-nesting bird.
Yep.
Also, that big home range makes them quite difficult to manage, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, this bird is... so talk about the home range thing first. They cover such a wide area that, like I said, you can't just make a park around every, even if you find a spot where there's night parrots, it's likely that they're probably spending some of their time, and we know the ones that pull and do this, we know they spend some of their time on like a neighbouring property, we know they spend some of their time on pull and we know they spend some of their time elsewhere, so that's just, that's interesting to know. Management is not going to be like I said, protected areas are probably not it's important to protect roosting locations, that sort of thing, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all of management. Yeah. In terms of other threats, look, my conclusion is that this, the night parrot it's a critical weight range mammal. All the conclusions around these things, that small, they're basically tasty meal size for a fox or a cat. Yeah. And then you bring in some introduced herbivores that chomp up all the ground, reduce the cover. You bring in some fire that reduces the amount of cover available to them, and suddenly there's, the cats are like, oh, these things are easy catch. And what's more than something like the night parrot, which has never had to deal with an efficient nocturnal predator before. And so about a month ago, for the very first time, I saw one of these parrots at night in not where I expected to see it. It was just out in one of its feeding grounds.
Just hanging out?
Yeah, about 1 kilometre away from where they roost, and I just happened to see it. And I got out of the car to try and take a photo, and this thing that sort of looked over its shoulder at me, and then it sort of waddled a little bit, and then it looked back over its shoulder and waddled a bit more. So this thing is not,
it's not super.
And then it squats down a bit and tries to play that. Oh, you can't see me,
So it's not super predator averse.
No, definitely not. And so when I saw that, I'm like, oh, you poor thing. Cats are your problem.
Yeah.
Obviously interplays with a lot of other things.
Yeah, but, potentials from the grazing and habitat damage
all
and
that sort of stuff. So
it's
not, we're not going to, like I said, I'd reinforce the point. We're not going to just be able to put a national park around them all. We've just got to do what we can to protect particular roosting locations, and then just really manage the rest of it.
Well, look, trying to put the whole world into a reserve is not going to work anyway.
There's
only so much land that we can reserve, and
I like eating steak too much to do that.
And that's another challenge, of course. Land modification and
yeah.
Even other things like invasive species like buffel grass and couch grass that have been brought in as feed for those grazing animals.
100%.
All very interesting stuff. And for me, what's most amazing is you're talking about seeing these birds hanging out. You just happen to see one, and this is the most elusive bird in the world.
I know.
And you get to hear their calls, and what their croaking and contact call sounds like. So I think we're pretty much done. I'm just very happy to have been sitting here with somebody who's actually seen them in the wild, and basically you get to hear their contact calls. But when are you heading back out there to hear some more night parrot chatter?
Well, don't worry, I'm a twitcher at heart, so don't worry. The first time I saw a night parrot, I did do a little fist pump. That someone a more measured researcher might not have done. But
not quite as subdued.
I certainly did. I'm actually heading out there in next week, but only for a short. Only for a short trip this one, just to keep tabs and move some recorders around, that sort of thing. Right. Actually doing some, I've got a friend who's going to fly me around in a light plane for a few days. We're going to go out looking for some more habitat to do.
So moving the data collection forward?
Yeah, just keep moving it further afield. We've searched pretty thoroughly in the area around where the birds are. We think we've got a pretty good handle on what is and isn't there. So now we're really looking to start pushing it a bit further afield. But look, I hope we find more out there. I'm certain there's more out there, but like I said, I'm afraid it's not going to be, they're not going to be easy to see for bird watchers.
No, that's for sure. Well, look,
it's going to be a while.
At least that means, there is a gem out there out in the arid zone that the birders are really going to be very, very keen to protect some of that landscape.
You can jump on the internet and go to the Night Parrot website and hear what they sound like, and I encourage everyone to get out and
I am going to do that. I have not done that yet.
Yep, find a spot where you can stand waist deep in spinifex, and if you hear a ding ding at about half an hour after sunset, give me a call.
That's wonderful. Nick, thank you very much. I guess just plugs here really quickly. I would encourage everybody to go to bushheritage.org.au. You can donate to Night Parrots there, and all of the money that will go there will go towards night parrot conservation and the other projects that Bush Heritage have going on around Australia, which is many. You can also go to birdsqueensland.org.au. Anywhere else that people can go to help with night parrot research?
Look, yeah, Bush Heritage is the main one. I'd also just like to plug, obviously, my university.
Oh, of course, the Uni of
University
Queensland,
Queensland. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be doing this PhD. And
Absolutely.
They support me massively, obviously, with facilities and funding and all
grants
that,
and
grants,
research,
all that sort of
space
stuff.
Hats off to them as well.
University
very
of Queensland, and Bush Heritage definitely a big one to give a plug to there. Without Bush Heritage, I wouldn't have a research site. So
no worries. That's right, guys. Bushheritage.org.au and birdsqueensland.org.au, and you can always check out the University of Queensland uq.edu.au as well. Nick, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully we can have you back on at some point if you've got some more night parrot research in the future.
Any chance to bang on about night parrots, I'll take. So thanks for the cake and thanks for the cocktail.
Always welcome, man. Always welcome. I guess hopefully we'll be seeing you in a few months. Cheers, guys. That's our episode. We'll have plenty more WCC coming at you in the next couple of weeks. Keep an eye out on our SoundCloud, on our YouTube, and on our Facebook. Cheers very much, and talk soon. Bye.